So this will be my lecture on the Napoleonic Wars. I haven't done one in a while. Um, this will not match up to my Great War lecture, but I think it will be pretty good just to have a general survey on um, this lesson, basically, because I believe the best way to go over the Napoleonic Wars is by lecture, not by a reading, because it constantly goes back and forth. So you do want to sum it up for students, the narrative, I would personally say, because it can be done in a day, I think. I don't know how long this one is going to be, but let's take a look and find out. But the Napoleonic Wars is separate from the French Revolution. By this point, the French Revolution is considered over with, and that's because the war is no longer about revolutionary ideas, but empire. It's about the French Empire, and it's all about Napoleon. Um, you'll see that his greed was his own undoing towards the end. But this is really the beginning of a new era in European history. Um, and we're going to see it with the collapse of the Treaty of Amiens. So I have to do some precursor to this, but I basically go over Napoleon in separate lessons, his rise to power, basically, after the end of the Terror and the Directory regime. After those two regimes collapsed, basically, we see Napoleon's rise to power for both regimes, basically, and his eventually rise to consul, first consul, and then he makes himself emperor of the French people. Um, and it was during the War of the Second Coalition where he was in Egypt. Well, not he eventually fled by himself, but the French were in Egypt, and this really scared the British because this would endanger their control over India, basically. Um, they feared the revival of the French presence in India. Um, so when the British expedition to Egypt pushed back the French, um, they beat them up pretty badly, but they were already beaten up basically because the whole expedition collapsed after the Battle of the Nile, basically, where the French were entrapped basically in the Middle East. Um, but the British made a deal: withdraw from Egypt, we'll make peace. So the Treaty of Amiens was made in 1802, and it was the only time of there was a peace between 1794 and 1815. That's about 20 years of constant warfare. It is the only time there was peace. A little over 400 days it lasted, a little over 1 year. Um, and this is a period where Napoleon could not resist expanding his imperial designs. He was always going to expand his imperial designs. So they made peace, Britain and France. It was never going to last. Um, and we see this during the peace where uh, the French expanded their influence in Switzerland, in Italy. They made the Kingdom of Etruria, where Napoleon was basically made monarch, and the Netherlands, Holland. Um, the Holy Roman Empire states were reorganized into bigger ones. Um, he sent a naval expedition to the Indian Ocean, big no-no. And he also became reinterested in Saint Domingue, which is today's Haiti. He started becoming interested. Napoleon became interested in creating an empire in the Americas. So all these things are going on. All these imperial designs are going on during the peace year. And Britain's like, we cannot have this. This is a big no-no. We're gonna have to go back to war. And the final straw that broke the back was the island of Malta. Island of Malta, I believe I don't know where it is on the map. Let me see here. Let's search it up on the map. Basically, Malta was the launching pad to launch an expedition into Egypt. This is the island Napoleon first used to get into Egypt for his expedition. Um, right below Syracuse. Okay, and you see the French basically sail to Malta, and then they sail to Egypt. Um, and this is given back to the Knights of St. John, Malta Island. Um, but then the British occupy it, and on the condition of this peace treaty, the British had to withdraw from this island. And strategically speaking, they're like, we can't do this. We cannot do this. So Napoleon did try negotiating a way out for the British to get out of Malta, but basically the French will eventually have it again. But he did want to have the peace to last a little longer. The British did not, particularly when William Pitt rose back to power as prime minister, the younger. Um, and the British declared war basically because this issue on Malta couldn't be solved. So the British and the French are back at war, and France under Napoleon is thinking of an invasion on Great Britain during these first years when the Napoleonic Wars begin, basically between Britain and France. And he's thinking of invading Great Britain. Um, that cannot happen because Britain has the greatest navy in the world. So even though Napoleon has the greatest army in the world, um, most experienced trained army in the world, um, his quote is, "The elephant cannot beat the whale. The elephant is France. The whale is Britain. You can't get to Britain without a better fleet, basically." But Napoleon during these first years of the Napoleonic Wars is thinking of invading Great Britain. That never materializes, and we're going to soon see why. So throughout this era, there's constant coalitions, all the great powers of the world against France. And we'll soon see Britain form a coalition with Austria and Russia, and also the Kingdom of Naples. I'll get into that in a second after this, but basically, this is the War of the Third Coalition, where we cannot um, accept these French imperial designs in Western Europe. They are breaking the balance of power. We have to push them out of Italy and Holland. This will completely backfire. And this is the War of the Third Coalition, basically, where we have to stop Napoleon. We have to stop this from happening. He made himself an emperor. Um, uh, he, I believe he did something treacherous where there were royalist uprisings when he made himself emperor, basically, and he killed someone that would have inherited the French throne. I forgot his name, but it was very they basically took him out of it. He was in a neutral German state. They basically pulled him out of the state, and they had a secret trial for him and had him executed. This is very treacherous, um, very duplicitous, and it is on the basis that he was part of royal uprisings against Napoleon. He wasn't. So Napoleon is very brutal. He's a very brutal man, murderous, but he is on the go now. Napoleon against the world in the War of the Third Coalition. The War of the Second Coalition went on while France was in Egypt. The War of the First Coalition, Austria and Prussia during the first stages of the French Revolution. Um, Now it's Napoleon's time to shine, basically. He shined during, I believe it was the First Coalition where he basically conquered northern Italy. Um, and this is Austria going out on the advance against Napoleon, and they're going to be completely kicked and packing. It's very embarrassing. So a contingent of the Austrian army, one huge army under General Mack, goes on advance really quickly. And Napoleon makes a very quick gamble. There's one nation that's not part of the Third Coalition, and it's Prussia. They hesitate too long. Napoleon quickly invades Hanover, the Kingdom of Hanover, and Prussia doesn't react to this because they're still recovering, they're still uncertain. Their aura of invincibility that was created during the 7 Years' War is kind of shattering at this point. Um, where King Frederick William the Third of Prussia is too hesitant to go against Napoleon after all these other disasters. Um, so it's Austria, Russia, and Great Britain, and the Kingdom of Naples. It's really just Austria and Russia though, and we're going to soon see why. Where General Mack goes on the offensive really quick without the backing of the rest of the Austrian armies, and he gets mauled alive. Um, Basically, Napoleon takes a gamble, invades neutral Prussian territory, and completely encircles General Mack, basically. And he tries going on the retreat. You can see this, but it's too late. He's encircled. 20,000, about over 20,000 troops surrendered just like that. So they're already out of the game. Huge piece of the Austrian army is out of the game. And Napoleon's marshals and his huge army is starting to occupy the Austrian Empire. The remnants of the Austrian armies are on the retreat. Russia is still getting busy mobilizing, um, and Napoleon is like super what's the word, confident, basically, where he's slowly going throughout the Austrian Empire, spreading his army for an occupation, and the Russo-Austrian armies think they have him now. He's too confident. He's arrogant. Napoleon's arrogant. We're going to catch him on an offensive. So the Russo-Austrian armies go back out on an offensive, and they get mauled alive again at one of the worst battles, one of the most decisive battles Napoleon has ever had. I think it is the most decisive battle he has ever had, the Battle of Austerlitz, where basically the Russo-Austrian army goes out, strikes the defensive, and Napoleon's completely prepared. He has reinforcements just on the time. He thinks they think he's going to be on the defensive, but he does the exact opposite, where he heads out. He sends his marshals out on the defensive, and what ends up happening is Russo-Austrian army gets completely cut in half, completely unprepared for this maneuver, this offensive maneuver, and they end up losing about 27,000 men to France's 9,000. This is the worst. This is the worst battle ever. Very embarrassing. Um, Unfortunately, I don't know the whole history to it because this is a survey, but War of the Third Coalition was a disaster. Austria is occupied and defeated. Russia, before Prussia could join, um, Napoleon negotiates with them. But there is one good case. There is one good case with this War of the Third Coalition, and that's with Britain. Um, the Battle of Trafalgar, basically. Um, there's one good piece of news for the coalition wars, where basically the Franco-Spanish Navy is completely destroyed, basically, except for a few remnants of naval ships. But basically, they're going. This could the Franco, even though the British completely overpower the Franco-Spanish naval fleet, um, there was a possibility that the Danish fleet could have joined the Franco-Spanish naval fleet, first of all. And that would have changed it completely. Um, and if Emperor Paul of Russia wasn't assassinated, who knows what happened, actually. So, actually, no, he was assassinated later on. Let me see here. Battle. Well, let me check the years real quick. So the Battle of Trafalgar happened during the War of the Third Coalition. Um, I just want to make sure my years are right because, yeah, Emperor Paul of Russia, he was assassinated, and he actually leaned towards Napoleon, but he was assassinated in, let's see here, 1801. Yep. So if he was if he wasn't assassinated, would Russia have joined the War of the Third Coalition? Who knows? We don't know. He was a very eccentric man. Um, and the czar for this period is Alexander the First. Um, they learned a lot from this war, though. Huge embarrassment for him. Um, But basically, the Franco-Spanish Navy is decimated. Even though Horatio Nelson's um, contingent is a little bit smaller, they have way better ships, and he has them. He has his ships fight one on one instead of making his ships vulnerable to the whole Franco-Spanish fleet, basically. So he has his ships fight one on one with these ships, and they're all destroyed, basically. Almost all of them are destroyed. What this does is prevent the idea of an invasion onto Great Britain Island, because without a fleet, you cannot invade Great Britain. And Great Britain is confirmed as the only major naval power in the entire world after this battle. One of the most decisive battles in history, orchestrated by Horatio Nelson. Unfortunately, he was a man standing 5'4" tall, shorter than Napoleon. Unfortunately, though, he died during the battle right towards the end of it. But he survived just long enough to hear confirmation that Franco-Spanish fleet was decimated. most most decisive naval battle in history. Um, Unfortunately, I have to go back to Austria because while good news for Britain, bad news for Austria, Holy Roman Empire completely destroyed. It reached its end after about 1,000 years of existence. Austria was so basically the hegemonic leader of the German states. Not anymore. Napoleon gets rid of the Holy Roman Empire and creates the Confederation of the Rhine. And this would later serve as the basis for the First German Empire, or Germany in general. But the Confederation of the Rhine is completely different from the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire had hundreds of mini states. Now the Confederation of the Rhine has a few dozen German states. It's more consolidated. Not only that, Austria's kicked out of it. So now we have a new power game in Central Europe. And how does Napoleon get away with this exactly? Prussia. Prussia. Prussia still could join the war of the Third Coalition, but how does he stop it? He gives them Hanover. He gives them Hanover, the Kingdom of Hanover. I don't know. It's right here in this map. Yep, he gives Prussia that for appeasement. King Frederick William III says it's a pretty good deal. So he makes peace with Napoleon. Except it's very shameful. And Russia has to make peace too now, because Russia is the only one in the game basically. Britain is busy doing its own thing, really. I'll get into it later on. I had to make a second video for that because I didn't go through all the reasons. I'm trying to make it easy for myself. But what was I saying? I lost my train of thought. Prussia has to give up a lot of prestige by bending the knee to Napoleon. Basically, they're basically giving up their foreign policy, their foreign power over the German states, their influence. The Confederation of the Rhine, that is Napoleon's influence. All these German states, they don't listen to Prussia, they listen to me, Napoleon. So this is hugely embarrassing because Prussia, for most of the 18th century, was considered a world power. And now it's looking more and more like a second-rate power, which in fact it is a second-rate power, Prussia is. And this is clearly seen in the War of the Fourth Coalition. Basically, King Frederick William III could not live up to this embarrassment, or then being inactive to Napoleon's aggression. And they basically say, he basically gives an ultimatum to Napoleon. You make Prussia leader over the Confederation of the Rhine, or we go to war. And Napoleon is like, you gotta be kidding me. You're a joke. You serious about this? And Napoleon is like, yeah, are you serious about this? So Napoleon's army is getting huger and huger. He has it completely mobilized in southern Germany. He's completely prepared for this aggression anyways. So what happens is Prussia is completely invaded. Um, Prussia is completely invaded. Prussia's armies are kicked and packing. It's finally revealed that Prussia has become a secondary power. No longer are the glory days of Frederick the Great. where he defied the odds against three great powers simultaneously: France, Austria, and Russia, from complete annihilation. um, which were against all the tiny state. Um, no longer are those glory days existent. Prussia's army is not modern enough. It needs serious reforms. Um, but um, Russia and I should say Sweden as part of the coalitions as well. Russia and Britain are part of the War of the Fourth Coalition. And I just remembered I forgot to talk about Kingdom of Naples real quickly. So Queen of Naples under King Ferdinand joined the War of the Third Coalition, but before they could even do anything, Austria was basically occupied and defeated. So they're like, oh shit, they betrayed Napoleon after the War Second Coalition because they're in alliance after that coalition war ended. To keep the peace in Italy, basically, and he betrayed Napoleon. So he's like, my army is not able to defeat Napoleon's army, and he basically retreats to Sicily, where he's protected by the British Navy at sea, and he stays protected because the Franco-Spanish Navy is destroyed, annihilated. There are still some naval vessels in action, but no serious action can happen after that battle, basically. Um, uh, so that I had to touch onto that real quick. And there is Sweden as well. Sweden does join the coalition wars, and I will get into that in a bit. But the War of the Fourth Coalition, Prussia's occupied. King Frederick William III flees to East Prussia and then to the court of Tsar Alexander I. To reveal Prussia as a second-rate power. um, Now Russia learned a lot from the War of the Third Coalition. So they did put up a good fight. Unfortunately, the Polish plain, not an easy geographic area to defend, and they were forced on the retreat. So there were some decisive battles for Napoleon in Poland, but the Polish area, the Polish plain. But eventually the Russians made a tactical error where they put the infantry too close together, and they're decimated by infantry, and they're decisively defeated at the Battle of Friedland. So, and then Russia makes peace with Napoleon, but they do more than that. They forge an alliance, and here's why. Napoleon offers a new status quo in Europe, basically, and Tsar Alexander I basically sees that he has to accept it. Um, and his father, who was assassinated, had imperial designs that didn't really involve Europe. It did involve Europe. It didn't involve Western Europe and Central Europe. It involved Northern Europe and the Caucasus and the Ottoman territories, the Balkans. Um, so he basically there's basically a new status quo after the War of the Fourth Coalition. Russia and France are in alliance for these treaties of Tilsit. Tilsit is right here. They make two treaties. Basically, France and Russia come together, forge an alliance. They make war with Britain, basically, um, and they forge a new status quo. Russia focuses on its imperial designs elsewhere. Napoleon has his own sphere of influence in the West. Russia has its own sphere of influences in the East. And I'm going to touch on to that. And Russia really didn't have a choice because the British are kind of assholes. They're focusing on their own, at sea, basically. They're not really offering troops. Prussia was revealed to be a second-rate power after this war. They were quickly defeated. And Russia's like, we're standing alone here, basically. We can't do shit. So we might as well change our foreign policy and work with Napoleon. And this gradually goes downhill because it was never what they wanted to do. First of all, Napoleon did want to do it, but this is never what they wanted to do. First of all, Napoleon wanted to keep Russia contained. Russia did not want Napoleon telling them what to do. This was never going to work out. But they forged an alliance for the next 5 years, I believe, until 1812. Um, Let me look up the years of the War of the Fourth Coalition because I didn't put it down on the slide. 1806, 1807. No, just give me a few moments here to put down the years. I like having years. Makes makes it easier to understand the narrative because it's a huge one. uh, I'm definitely going past the hour on this. Whoopsie daisy, whatever. But 1805. It was mainly War of the Fourth Coalition lasted for this year basically. That's how quick the Austrians were embarrassingly defeated. It's just that peace was formalized in 1806. Um, that Auschwitz. Uh, Holy Roman Empire reformed into the Rhine Confederation. Prussia, able to be a secondary power, loses a lot of territories. Um, and there's something else that happens. We're going to see it in the map. There's going to be a few things that happen. So Napoleon wins a bunch of territories. What does he do? He reorganizes it. Um, he reorganizes it. So basically, you see here the Duchy of Warsaw. So early on during the French Revolution, basically Russia, Prussia, and Austria all destroy Polish, Lithuanian Commonwealth and each take territories for themselves. So it's sort of an artificial state is recreated called the Duchy of Warsaw, and it's given over to King Augustus III of Saxony, the Kingdom of Saxony right here, in the Rhine Confederation, and he's an ally to Napoleon. So he creates a buffer state, Napoleon here, um, after the War of the Fourth Coalition. And Russia still owns considerable territories of the former Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, but obviously they lose a lot of territories. Austria loses a lot of territories. Prussia loses a lot of territories. Austria is completely kicked out of Italy after the War of the Fourth Coalition, as you can see here. Um, this map is not the best map because there's certain things that happened after the War of the Fourth Coalition, in the War of the Fifth Coalition, which I'll get into basically. Um, and there's only one major power standing left. I mean, there's Sweden, but there's one major power in this island, Sicily, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, which is Piedmont, Sardinia, which is picked back to this island. Now, there's only and there's also Portugal, but there's one there's one power left standing Napoleon's way. Prussia and Austria have been completely humbled. Italy is his. Germany is his. Napoleon is kicking ass, and there's one nation left in his way, Great Britain, and he cannot get to them because they have the greatest navy in the world. He can't invade Britain, and you have a huge colonial empire, and Napoleon doesn't have the sea power. He doesn't have the sea power to do anything, but he does have a land power. Europe, he doesn't have sea power. So how do we stop Great Britain? So this is a war by other means. He comes up with this idea called the continental system. It's pretty straightforward. Um, this is one of this is the worst. This was one of the first setbacks to Napoleon's downfall. Although it did make sense, which is basically we're going to completely blockade Britain from trade with continental Europe, and this does to some effect work, but it was a double-edged sword basically. So Britain loses a huge chunk of its trade, like 50% of its trade, half of its trade, boom, gone. Ports are completely blockaded in Europe, all over the place. All these empires and territories are forced to concede to this continental system, basically, where they have to close all their ports. And how do you have? I mean, we still have ports to this day. How do you trade? I mean, today we trade heavy goods like oil, I don't know, bricks, bulk goods, heavy goods by sea. We can't really do that by airplane. We could, but we can't do it to such heavy capacity as by sea, right? We still sea trade is still significant to this day, but it's even more significant because airplanes didn't exist back then. So this is like the main way we trade back in the old days by sea, and all the ports are closed. This is a double-edged sword because trade in Europe is completely disrupted. It hurts the entire economy in Europe. Um, but it hurts Britain's economy as well, because all these colonial goods are not being traded in Europe anymore. There's a black market, obviously, and it grows significantly because how can we live without coffee? How can we live without sugar, right? Um, but Britain, all these other colonial goods, I can't think six. Like you can't have soap. I don't know. You can't have cotton clothes. We have to wear wool clothes now. Um, so this is like this annoys a lot of people, basically, a lot of rich people, especially. And this hurts Britain's economy because their economy is all based on colonial trade. So this does hurt them in the long run, and we don't know how badly it would hurt them overall if the Napoleonic era lasted longer than it did. Unfortunately, Napoleon was too greedy for his own good, but it was a double-edged sword. And then now there's one nation that took too long to join the continental system, and it's a nation that was neutral for most of this period. And it's a nation called Portugal. Now this is the second major. This is Napoleon's second mistake here, where he's basically pause the video. I'll be right back. So this is Peninsula War, where basically there's one nation that took too long to join the continental system. That is Portugal. And that is because Portugal is heavily dependent on its colonial trade and trade with Britain. Britain is basically dominating Portugal's economy, and they really need trade in Portugal. Britain does not really need trade in Portugal. Portugal really needs trade in Britain. Um, and Napoleon is annoyed at this. So Spain is a traditional ally to France. There was a short time when Spain declared war on, well, France declared war on Spain, but that was because they both was a mutual declaration war. Spain temporarily declared war on France only because they executed their king in 1816, and their relatives aboard the monarchy. Because Spain and France are relatives, the monarchies, but they go back to into an alliance, their traditional alliance, when the Spanish fleet starts being attacked by the British. Um, Typical British, exploitative, and they kind of see the Spanish going into alliance with France anyways, because they're traditional allies. Um, Excuse me, I need a moment. Um, I really have to pause for that. But basically, they invade Portugal. But, but Napoleon makes another move after his invasion of Portugal, and made absolutely zero sense. He decides to invade Spain. I mean, Spain has been fighting hard, thick and thin, for Napoleon throughout these years, and it really made no sense. The Bourbon, King Charles of Spain, the fourth, I believe, was going through thick and thin with Napoleon. He's like, "Hey, I'm with you all the way, man." So it really made no sense to do this, the invasion of Spain. So he has his armies in Spain to invade Portugal, but then he has them on standby to invade Spain, unbeknown to King Charles IV. And for Napoleon saw this as fortunate to him, where there was like a domestic dispute going on with Spanish monarchy, where the prime minister, I forgot his name, was very unpopular with the populace. He like outlawed bullfighting or something like that, and his King Charles's son Ferdinand wants to be king, and he's trying to oust his father. And this huge domestic dispute happens where the son basically says, "I'm the king now." Um, Napoleon like comes in. He gets his brother Joseph Bonaparte to be the new king of Spain, and he ousts them. And immediately a war happens. Spanish armies push back against the French, but they're eventually defeated. Um, Spain is captured eventually. There's huge fights. It takes a bit, um, except it's not fully captured because the Spanish go on a guerrilla warfare basically. And Spanish terrain, the Iberian Peninsula's terrain is very variable. And it's very easy to fight guerrilla warfare on this peninsula. And the Spanish hate the French now because they're attacking their nation. I mean, Spain is already in danger due to the fact that the navy is destroyed, and the British are, guns ho in the Americas basically, doing whatever the fuck they want. Um, so they're very worried about the empire, the Spanish, and now they see themselves being betrayed by their ally Napoleon. So this is very treacherous. But as we can see, Napoleon's personality, he's a greedy man and he is treacherous. So Spain, this is a huge mistake because the Peninsula War lasts until the end of the Napoleonic Wars, until the end of the Napoleonic era, because Spain keeps fighting, and guess who else keeps fighting? Someone else that I have right here. This guy's name is Sir Arthur Wesley. Who else keeps fighting? Portugal. And guess what? Portugal expels the Franco-Spanish armies with the aid of the British. The British hold on to Portugal through the defensive capabilities of Sir Arthur Wesley. He goes on an offensive throughout the Peninsular War, Sir Arthur Wesley, and he was criticized by this British for some reason by the British. In retrospect, though, we obviously know that he was very effective as a general, Sir Arthur Wesley, and he was made Viscount for Wellington, eventually Duke of Wellington, for his success basically, and he keeps Portugal in Portuguese hands and away from the French for a good period of time until 1812 when he's finally able to go on the offensive in Spain. Um, so this war made no sense, made zero sense. Future actions of Napoleon made no sense, and we're going to see why later on a little bit. So he betrays his ally. The continental system is a double-edged sword, and Russia and France are not going to be allies forever, obviously. And Britain is still the greatest naval power in the world. So this is the French Empire, though. This is really, I mean, Spain takes, so they, I mean, sorry, Austria takes advantage of this peninsula war. They see this, and they see, I mean, Austria faces so many humiliations, basically, and they see this as a chance to fight back, regain lost territories. If they can't stand this humiliation, they lost like six of their territories, basically, Austrian Empire, second-rate empire now. So they have this war, the fifth coalition. It's not a coalition with Britain, Sardinia, and Sicily. I mean, it's not a real coalition. Russia doesn't join it because they're in alliance with France. Prussia doesn't join it because they're like, we need to modernize. We can't do this. But Prussia says they will. Frederick William III says we will do it, and Russia joins the coalition with us. So there's three of us. They say no. Russia says no. So Prussia says no. So it's just the war between France and Austria. So this war is interesting in that the Austrian Empire's armies were not destroyed, and they actually initially scored some decisive victories against the French. So the French were not fully prepared because of the Peninsular War. But Napoleon eventually recuperates with his marshals, defeats the Austrian Empire, and they pay a huge heavy price for it, a lot of indemnities. They had to pay a huge sum of money, basically. But this is the French Empire. At this point, Napoleon looks invincible, and we see more of his treachery, basically. Right here in the map. Let me see if I can zoom up a little bit better. So we see the reality here. We see this color here, ruled directly by Napoleon, the dark colors. So originally they're saying, oh, he's creating this like precursor, like this. Some historians are saying, oh, this looks sort of like the precursor to the European Union, because all these states are still existent. See, all these German states are still existent. The Austrian Empire, so that's complete bullshit. It was all about Napoleon gaining power. He just knew he couldn't directly annex territories just like that. There has to be some semblance of balance of power, so to speak, in Europe. But he completely dominates um, politically, and he completely dominates directly in these territories. He directly annexes Holland, directly annexes parts of northern Italy, the Illyrian provinces, and pieces of Spain into France directly. So this is the French Empire. It completely controls Europe, Europe basically. Austria and Prussia have to basically do what Napoleon tells them. It's humiliating. Um, Especially Warsaw exists as a buffer state. Um, um, Napoleon puts his sisters, his brothers directly into thrones, marshals, people of commoner origins, made into princes and dukes. Um, this is not the age of hereditary monarchy. This is the age of upstarts, people of common origin, making themselves into power figures, making themselves into huge landowners, barons. Um, but you know, there's some things he does. Napoleon. This is the first time in Italy's history since the Roman Empire it's been completely unified, basically, so to speak. It really is unified, Italy and Germany, through Napoleon's rule. They're allied to France, but they're basically all listening to the French Empire on what to do, economically, politically. It's just I would say, and culturally, through the Napoleonic Code. However, there's two things that Napoleon does that does cause resentment, and it's heavy taxation and mass conscription. So we have a multinational army now for the French Empire, but it's forced conscription. So people are not very happy to do this. You know, they're being forced into Napoleon's army's ranks. But we have a multicultural army. This is nothing like this has really ever been seen before in Europe. I mean, since the time of Charlemagne in the Middle Ages. So this is a complete change in Europe or fifth coalition. It's not really. Oh, and there was attempt by Britain to invade Holland. I mean, not Holland, Antwerp, Belgium, completely backfires while the Austrians were trying to fight back and regain lost territories. Completely backfires, huge embarrassment. They're trying to do something like what they were doing in Portugal, did not work. So, anyways, we have an interlude with Russia before. So Russia is eventually invaded in 1912 by Napoleon. The alliance breaks down completely. Napoleon invades 1812, and that's when everything goes down for Napoleon. But before that, there's an interval where Russia having a change in foreign policy, and imperialism. Napoleon saying, "Don't look at Western Europe and Central Europe. Look elsewhere. Don't look at Poland. You have other gains to make, and there's gains to make. There's a lot of gains to make. So I have a sticky note here for these wars. Russia, there's a lot of Russia has a lot of wars in the Napoleonic Wars, their own internal wars. The Russo-Persian War of 1804 to 1813, the Russo-Swedish War of 1808 to 1809, the Russo-Turkish War of 1806 to 1812, and the Austro-Russian War of 1809. But that was the war of the Fifth Coalition. And even though Russia had to go to France's aid, they were very reluctant and really didn't do anything. And that pissed Napoleon off too. But Russia under Tsar Alexander I is making clear agreements, and that is seen here in Northern Europe, also known as the Northern Question. What happens? What's going to happen in Scandinavia, basically? So, believe it or not, Sweden back then used to be a huge regional power. It had Swedish Pomerania, pieces in Germany, Finland. Um, and this is Sweden's king. He becomes very unpopular because he has Sweden join the coalition wars and they completely backfire because even before they can even get mobilized, the Swedish armies, they basically see their allies completely defeated by the time they like arrive in mainland Europe. It's a huge joke, basically. So Sweden loses territories and influence, and Sweden eventually becomes completely surrounded by both sides. Um, so Tsar Alexander first makes headway by conquering Finland from Sweden. Sweden, under this king, is completely unprepared for the war, for a winter war. They weren't expecting a winter war. Tsar Alexander first quickly gets Finland in the year, basically. Half of Sweden territory gone. Finland is never given back to Sweden, and the Swedish Empire is effectively um, induced to its further power. Um, it used to be a huge power to be reckoned with in the times of the 30 Years' War under Augustus Adolphus, the king of Sweden. Not anymore. Those glory days are far gone. Um, and this guy, King Gustavus IV Adolf, is acting like the glory days are still there. Um, he was in for a rude surprise. You know, it was so bad. We got so bad for Sweden. I'm going to get into it a bit here, but it got so bad for Sweden that he got removed as king. The Swedish monarchy, the Swedish court basically kicked him out as king and his son. He cannot be king ever again. Um, so Sweden, and they go to war. Sweden is also at war with Kingdom of Denmark, Norway. So Norway is part of Denmark back then. Norway was never actually an independent power for most of its history. Um, During this period, as part of Denmark. Later on, so Sweden went later on to, so they lost Finland, they got butthurt. So they went later on to acquire other territories, Norway basically, because what else can they get to make up for this humiliation? But it was through dynastic ties, basically. But this kingdom, the kingdom of Denmark, Norway, is also a war of Sweden. And here's why. Um, Denmark has had the fifth largest navy in the world. And Britain was very scared about this because if it ever became part of the French's power, they're like this threatens our seas. So basically, Britain comes. I mean, Denmark, like Portugal, is a neutral nation. I mean, this is hypocrisy. Basically, I'm about to say hypocrisy. I mean, Napoleon is treacherous. British are treacherous as well in their history. Let's be honest. They basically Denmark is completely neutral, and Britain comes out of nowhere, bombards Copenhagen, and confiscates the Danish navy. Not only that, they occupy and take control of the Danish colonies in India, and during this chaos, there's a minor republic temporarily created in Iceland. This colony is belongs to the Danish, um, but it's quickly destroyed. This republic, but with the chaos. So basically, this force. I mean, Denmark is like you just did this to us. So Denmark allies itself. It was going to remain neutral throughout the war, most likely. But because of this, it joined sides with Napoleon. And Napoleon was going to eventually force Denmark's hand, anyways. So it was either going to be Britain or Denmark. Too late. But Denmark, I mean, there's no winning the time or anything. So Denmark, the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, allies itself to France from Napoleon, and then they declare war on Sweden. Why is this? Sweden is a huge ally of Britain, and this guy, King Gustavus IV, is like, "Give me money, Britain. I need money now." And Britain is concerned elsewhere in its imperial design, particularly Portugal, Egypt, India, South Latin America. Sweden is not like on the top of their priority. There's racism off their team. So he has nothing but problems. That's so unpopular. Such bad luck, but he really should have been more competent. He was incompetent. That was his main problem. He was incompetent, really. But it's such bad luck, too. But really incompetent. So Sweden, as a major empire, those glory days are forever over, basically. Now, the Eastern question, though, the Ottoman Empire, are their glory days over? The Swedish? Um, yeah, yes. So basically, what happens here? I created a region through Muhammad Ali, basically Egypt, right? treaty Amiens. The French withdraw for the treaty, the peace, and that British expedition withdraws too. But what happens basically is chaos. Egypt is left in pieces, left to pick up the pieces. The Mamluk stays. Its military case that ruled Egypt for centuries is left in disorder. Egypt is left in chaos after Napoleon's expedition, and they have to restore order. And what the this is, I mean, they're regional governors basically, the Mamluk Beys, but the Sultan has to restore order to his part of the Ottoman Empire. And he basically sends a force of 6,000 Albanians under this guy, this general named Muhammad Ali. And he's not even Egyptian, he's Albanian. And what does he do? He makes himself ruler of Egypt. Let's start. Now, this is not what the Sultan had in mind. Um, he defies the odds. He just politically outmaneuvers all his opponents. He makes himself ruler of Egypt. And he becomes ruler of Egypt until I think 1848. And this is not what the Sultan wanted at all. But he has to do it eventually because Muhammad Ali eventually ousts Mamluk Beys with his leaders. He massacres them all. He defeats the British Expeditionary Force. Um, and he becomes popular with local rulers. So this Albanian, this literal adventurer, becomes ruler of Egypt. He's an adventurer who's not even Egyptian. He becomes ruler of Egypt for decades. And he's considered the founding father of modern Egypt. He industrialized Egypt. So he has his own little thing going on in Egypt. Egypt's technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but he's living his own. He's living his own dream. Um, he's literally ruining it on his own. He's not doing it for the Sultan. He's doing it on his own. So Ottoman Empire is quickly collapsing. And remember, Napoleon enticed Russia to focus on imperial designs elsewhere. So in Russia, I mean, Ottoman Empire, throughout the first years of the Napoleonic Wars, it's out, especially after Napoleon's expedition. It's constantly discussed between the great powers, but we should just partition the Ottoman Empire between each of us. And they never really get on a solid footing on that, mainly because the balance of power. Britain doesn't want Russia too powerful. Russia doesn't want Austria-Hungary too powerful, vice versa. Austria doesn't think we can control the Balkans. Russia also followed this policy for a while. We can even policy. We can control the Ottoman Empire because they're so weak. But then they have to deal with other foreign empires getting in their way. So the Ottoman Empire during the Napoleonic Wars tried to stay neutral, but they couldn't because the great powers constantly got involved. And after the War of the Fourth Coalition, Russia basically goes to war with the Ottoman Empire. And they don't actually get territories. And there's a reason why the war of 1812. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. And that's why this war didn't really go well for it did go well for the Russians, but they didn't gain any considerable territories because the Ottomans and the Russians quickly made peace. Just so they could be Napoleon. There is one territory here, this mining strip of territory that gained semi-autonomy called Serbia. Now, I believe I'm going to do it in another lecture where this piece of territory, this is the beginning of Balkan independence, basically during the Napoleonic Wars. This tiny territory here, Serbia, gains semi-autonomy. But it was a huge defeat for the Ottomans. They were decisively defeated in most battles, not all. They gained a few victories, but they were decisively defeated in this war. And there's another war, one final war for Russia in this interlude, the Russo-Persia War. So the Safavid Empire, by this point, is done for. The dynasty is over with. The dynasty that rose Iran during the Napoleonic era is the Qajar dynasty. They're a Turkic tribe. And they're worried about modernizing their nation. And because it's weak. It has the same problems as the Ottoman Empire. So the Sultans, I would talk about the Sultans, but they constantly get assassinated. I mean, they had I believe they had two different sultans actually like killed in the same exact year for coups. Um, Sultan Selim the Third, Sultan Mehmed, and Sultan Murad. I don't know the fourth, but these sultans, two of these sultans, um, were executed. But the first sultan, Sultan Selim the Third, I don't know the other. I have to look it up now. But Sultan Selim the Third wanted to modernize the Ottoman Empire. Is that gonna work? No, it doesn't. So the only way he could modernize the empire is from raising taxes and restructuring the army. But the traditional 40s, the Janissaries, are resistant to these reforms, and the Ottoman Empire is already being heavily taxed as it is. So when you don't have enough money and you have the traditional power groups resisting changes, you can't do much. So he does have reforms. He does create significant reforms, um, but they create resentment, and that what causes his downfall, the coup. He becomes that's not him, but so he's eventually ousted through a coup. This guy, he's traditionalist, anti-reform. He becomes sultan, but then there's unpopularity with him. He becomes sultan. This guy becomes sultan Muhammad II. He is he was related to Selim the Third, who was a reformer. So in the end, the reformer side comes out on top. But they have these challenges. Traditional 40, there's resistant reforms. We don't have enough stratagem to raise taxes for these reforms. So there's very little they can do. And Iran has this thing as that problem. Now, unlike, I mean, and just like that, I mean, that issue of domestic policy, they have the same exact issue on foreign policy where how did they stay neutral? um, so Iran, their glory days are far over from the gunpowder days, where they see Russia casually invade the Caucasus, um, and they annexed Georgia directly. And Georgia had its own kingdom, their own king. They're like, it's outrageous. The king of Georgia, basically, the annexation of the territory. And Iran sees the Caucasus as their sphere of influence, not Russia's. So they go to war to gain territory back. They, uh, they gain a bunch of Khanates, Khanate territories, Dagestan, Georgia, during this period of Russia. And Iran is fighting to get these territories out of their hands. Um, it fails. Iran's army is simply not modern enough. Iran simply doesn't have the taxes to keep a modern army even afloat. Um, and just like Iran, they can't. They have issues. Just like the Ottoman Empire, Iran has issues with foreign policy. Basically, the great powers forge alliances with the Ottoman Empire, Iran, as they see fit. They don't really care about the powers. They don't treat them as equal, basically. So originally, Iran is allied to Britain. When they go to war with Russia, Britain is like, we're not really interested um, in helping you. So Iran turns to Napoleon. And Napoleon, now remember, Napoleon here, if his invasion of Russia did succeed, he had very ambitious designs. He saw this as a freeway ticket, an alliance with the Ottoman Empire, an alliance with Iran. That is the yellow brick road to India to to basically attack British interests in India. If his invasion of Russia, theoretically succeeded, which he would have. But this is his yellow brick road, Napoleon's yellow brick road. In Iran, the Qajar Shah forges good ties with Napoleon for a bit, where the French, modernized, trained the Iranian armies. And unfortunately, they're resisting the reforms, just like the Ottoman Empire's armies were resisting reforms because these reforms attack traditional 40. It's offensive to them. Um, and eventually, Napoleon eventually defeated in Russia. Iran's like, okay, now we have to go back to Britain. Um, very, very weak. And there's something else going on in the Ottoman Empire here I should touch on. which is the rise of the Wahhabism, which is radical Islam, and they're very resistant to the Sultan's authority, basically in Saudi Arabia and in the holy cities. Um, and there's also Kurdistan, where there's extremist Kurds. Um, the Ottoman Empire is the big the Napoleonic Wars is also the beginning of the end of the Ottoman Empire, really. The very slow end of the Ottoman Empire, because by this point they're already talking about dividing up the Ottoman Empire. It's just that they couldn't come to an agreement at this point, the great powers. Um, they could have done it. They really could have partitioned the Ottoman Empire in the early 1800s, but they didn't. Um, and this is what's going on with Russia and Italy before Napoleon's invasion on him. Um, and Napoleon's invasion of Russia is disastrous. I will get into it later on. I have to finish the materials first. So I'm going to stop here and I'm going to reach right back and connect videos. All right, so I'm going to finish up my Napoleon lecture. I, I paused for a few days to finish up my reading on it. Um, Before I get into Napoleon's downfall, I do have to make a few more mentions on what's going on in the rest of the world, particularly with Britain. So after the Battle of Trafalgar, Britain is basically the naval power of the world, and it's not wasting its time grabbing colonies, and expanding in India. It's grabbing colonies, Cape colonies. So the Netherlands, or the Kingdom of Holland, British Holland, is annexed by France. So basically, all their colonies, in Britain's point of view, are up for grabs, basically. So they grabbed the island of Ceylon, Cape Colony, South Africa, um, and the East Indies right here, and the colonies in the West Indies. The islands are all taken, um, and the French colonies all taken as well. There's a colony here in the Indian Ocean, which is French. Mauritius is taken by Britain. So Britain is becoming the greatest global power in the world currently, in this period of time. And this really sets the precedent for it becoming the greatest global empire in the world for the next century and a half. And there is another conflict that's going on simultaneously with the Napoleonic Wars, particularly the War of 1812, also known as this forgotten conflict to the British, lasts until 1815, the same time interval as the Napoleonic Wars when they reach a conclusion. Um, this war, the United States declared war on Britain because Britain started using this policy called impressment, where they're basically taking American sailors, uh, capturing them and forcing them to work on their Navy vessels. Because Britain's Navy has gotten so large, they don't have enough sailors to manage their ships. So this is very, I guess you could say, controversial to the point where it's like, yeah, you're kidnapping our citizens basically. And there's another controversial issue here where the British are forging alliances with the Native American tribes that the Americans are at war with. The U.S. is at war with. So basically, the United States is like, yeah, we're going to war with Britain because of these two major issues, and the war ends in stalemate. I'm not going to get into it here because it's a completely different subject, but that's going on simultaneously with the Napoleonic Wars. No major changes, though. But it does ensure Louisiana territory remains in the U.S.'s hands, not British hands. Um, and and the British also tried to. They had what's called this imperial fever at where they are at war with Spain as well. You see the Spanish Empire; it's very, huge. They create these grand designs to capture all of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. Um, that quickly is shown to be not realistic. Where there's two expeditions planned and prepared to invade Buenos Aires, the capital of today's Argentina, and Montevideo, the capital I think it is the capital of Uruguay. two major ports. So they think, oh, now the Spanish are completely cut off from their colonies in the Americas because we dominate the seas now. We can take control of these colonies. Unfortunately, the natives hate the British more than Spanish. So when they come waltzing in on Buenos Aires, all the locals force them out. Um, so the British come to realize they can't take over the Latin American colonies, but they do increasingly depend on trade with the Latin American colonies, because of the continental system in Europe, where they're completely cut off of trade, not trade with Latin America, and it's a huge market to export, so it grows tremendously. By the 1820s, I think 15% of Britain's exports are going to Latin America. But there's just like how there's a collapse between a growing collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Um, there's a growing collapse of the Spanish Empire. The Western question: what is going to happen to these colonies of Brazil and Spain in the Americas now that, especially after the Peninsular War, where Spain is in the civil war basically with their former ally Napoleon, and are fighting a guerrilla warfare. What's going to happen to their colonies while the colonies overseas watching the Spanish monarchy fall to pieces? How are they going to react to this? Um, there's going to be movements for independence basically all across Latin America. So there's one key difference for the Empire of Brazil, the monarchy of Portugal. When Napoleon invades the country, it flees to Brazil. So currently, during this period, the Portuguese monarchy is residing in Brazil. So they're not facing as much issues. And there's major reforms in Brazil as a colony. It's given all these major powers now that the monarchy is there, residing there as its home base. So there's more order in Brazil than Spanish America. So the Spanish Empire in the Americas is made up of four viceroyalties. um, Viceroyalty of New Spain, the Viceroyalty of New Granada, the Viceroyalty of Peru, and the Viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. Um, so there's independence movements in every single one of these viceroyalties, except for the Viceroyalty in Peru. It's heavily royalist to the Spanish monarch. Two sides, patriots and royalists. Peru is heavily royalist, but every other viceroyalty witnesses independence movements basically, and they all fail except for the one in the Rio de la Plata, where Argentina basically succeeds in gaining its independence. Uruguay succeeds too as well, although it's a royalist strong base in Montevideo, and Paraguay. Those are the only two. That's the Rio de la Plata is the only area where independence movements succeed. This is a separate lesson though. Um, and then there's also Haiti, of course, where it succeeds in repulsing Napoleon's expedition. Um, so Haiti is independent. But these are two separate topics, really. This is the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire, the Napoleonic Wars, and these conflicts last all up into the 1820s. Um, and this is something else I'm going to get into, but this is the end. This is the beginning of the end of the Spanish Empire. All these independence movements are coming about. The Western question is: are these colonies going to be replaced with Britain? No, no. There's going to be new countries, um, and the post-colonial era for Latin America is interesting, but that's also another subject that I won't get into for this lecture. So yeah, Haiti and Spanish colonies, um, independence movements is the beginning. This is also connected to nationalism too, of course, right? If we're gonna, this is That's a huge subject as well for Europe later on in the 1800s. So, anyways, back to the main narrative, the beginning of the end for Napoleon and his empire, the Russian invasion of 1812. So this was not. I need to breathe in for a moment. So I included notes here to make it quicker and easier for me. So Napoleon and Russia were not getting along. A war was inevitable on the horizon. It was not surprising. This was not like Hitler's surprise invasion of the Soviet Union. This was expected to happen. And Napoleon is at the height of his power right before the invasion, ironically, where he mobilizes 600,000 troops out of, I think, 2.4 million of the French Imperial Army. This is the most troops he's ever amassed so far. This is a very huge moment for the French Empire to invade Russia. Can't stop this man, but there's a few reasons for why this started to happen and why Napoleon was so arrogant, which was going to be so easy for him. Um, so there was financial collapse happening for the French Empire. Basically, all these war movements, all these war campaigns can't be sustained without conquest. Basically, where we have to keep getting more territories, more plunder, to sustain this huge ass army, basically. Um, and he looks more and more towards Russia because he can't fight overseas. There's no massive France is building up a lot of Navy ships and getting ready for combat on and off combat, but they're minor skirmishes basically with Britain. Um, so he can't do shit except for in his eyes, in his mind, invade Russia because relations between these two nations is collapsing. They're an alliance and it's collapsing. And the start of this collapse of an alliance begins with the continental system. Basically, with Russia's economy is in tatters over the 4 or 5 years it's in the continental system with France because it is heavily reliant on trade in Britain. The Russian Empire is so heavily reliant. It's very reliant on its exports for timber and hemp in Britain. It's very lucrative for the Russians. And because of this vacant trade, basically, the Russian Empire can't manage finances, so it withdraws from the continental system under Tsar Alexander the First. And then a great huge point of uh, tension is the Duchy of Warsaw. This is basically their territory they conquered from the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they're very worried about a revival of a Polish nation because this is their territory in their point of view, and they don't want a new buffer state. They want it to be contained. Poland wants independence basically because wasn't that long gone. It's that long ago it was a nation, but this is the second point of contention, where despite all these conquests against Sweden, Iran, the Ottomans, despite all these conquests, uh, Poland is far more important to the Russians. So this is a point of contention that there's no negotiation on really. And there's a huge theme that makes Napoleon very arrogant, and it's his marriage to Austrian Archduchess Marie Louise, forging an alliance with Emperor Francis the First of Austria. So Archduchess Mary Louise is the daughter of Emperor Francis the First. This really solidifies an alliance between Austria and France, because Napoleon is, first of all, officially um, a hereditary monarch because through this, not a monarch, he's an emperor, of course, but he now has permanent royal ties. He divorces Josephine. She was having open affairs. I mean, he was too, but hers were in a way far more blatant, where it's more of a national embarrassment because um, the French citizens are much more aware of this happening, these affairs he's having. But he divorces her, um, marries Marie Louise, has a child with her. So he is forging his path to his royal dynasty, so to speak, or so it seems. Um, so because of this, Napoleon is confident that Austria will be helping him, well, not helping him remain neutral when he invades Russia. Of course, they were duplicitous. Austria basically fought the war for the Fifth Coalition all on their own. It was the Franco Austrian War, really. It's called the War of the Four Coalitions, really the Franco-Austrian War. Um, Russia went to war with them, but they didn't really fight Russia. Russia's an alliance with France, so it had to fight the Austrian Empire, but it didn't really engage in battle, which pissed Napoleon off. But now that Russia and I mean Austria and France are officially allied to one another, he's not worried about Austria like declaring war on him when he invades Russia, which is a huge point that makes him very confident to do it. And not only that, the Ottoman Empire and Swedish flanks, um, so to speak. Uh, I don't want to use that map because that's the aftermath. Let's see here. So basically, you see Sweden here and Ottoman Empire here. Russia's at war with the Ottoman Empire. Russia is occupying Finland. I don't want to use this map because it's not good. Russia is occupying Sweden. I mean, not Sweden, Finland, and Sweden wants that. They think Napoleon thinks Sweden's going to want that territory back because it was always part of the Swedish Empire, Finland, and the Ottoman Empire is holding a huge army up in the Balkans with the Russians. He thinks because Russia's busy fighting these two wars, or they're done fighting the war against Sweden, but they have an army occupying Finland. So because of this holdup, these two flanks, right? Uh, he thinks that Russia is super weak because of this. Um, However, Russia is prepared because Russia signs an agreement with Sweden, where Sweden says they're giving up Finland permanently, but in exchange for that, Sweden wants Russia's help to annex Norway, basically, to become part of the Swedish Empire, to make up for this lost territory. And we're going to take this away from Denmark, the Danes. Um, so Russia signs an agreement with Sweden for this. And because of this, Russia is able to withdraw all their army forces from Finland. So those forces are prepared for the Russian invasion. The invasion of Russia. And not only that, the Ottoman Empire is so weak, financially in ruins because of this war, this lengthy war with the Russian, where as soon as the invasion's on the horizon, Russia makes peace. The Ottomans a quick hastened peace, basically where Russia is given more rights in Moldavia, Wallachia, and Serbia, but they don't really gain any territories because they're very quick on making peace. And the Ottomans see this as a very favorable peace because they can't keep the war going. They're obliterated basically towards the end of it. So they quickly make peace, and the whole army is let go from this conflict to be prepared for the invasion of Russia. So that expectation Napoleon had failed. Um, so this is how the invasion looks. 600,000 troops. He's very confident. He's slowly marching because they have poor roads, the Russians. And the Russian army is basically going on the retreat for this whole invasion into their country. Um, so basically, they do a scorched earth policy where they basically destroy all their supplies and resources as they retreat. And Napoleon's army is huge. It's a double-edged sword now because all these supplies and resources in the Russian areas are being destroyed. And Napoleon is, his arrogance. He's expecting these resources to go to his huge ass army, where it can sustain itself basically in his head. Now it can't. Roads are poor, unlike in Central Europe and Western Europe, where the roads are much more advanced. The roads in Russia are very poor, hard to travel through, um, and they're very slow. It's very hard to maneuver basically. Um, so they slowly march towards Russia's not capital, ancient Muscovite capital, Moscow, the capital of Russia, St. Petersburg during this period. So they're slowly marching. Russian armies are destroying the resources that Napoleon could take advantage of. And basically, he goes to Moscow and he plunders and the Russians evacuate Moscow. This is a classic tale in Napoleonic Wars narrative. Um, so Moscow is like seen empty, and I was like, "Where's everyone?" So they're plundering the city. The city during Russian um, evacuation is accidentally set on fire. Um, so this is not this is a policy that's going to succeed, the scorched earth policy. But this was very detrimental to the Russians as well, and the winter is going to settle in. But 70 miles from the Russian capital is the Russian armies, and Napoleon goes to battle with them in what's called the Battle of Borodino. It's a decisive victory. However, um, things are going to turn out for the worst because his grandass army doesn't have supplies to sustain itself. Um, its horses are being used for food, basically being butchered, and for some odd reason, Napoleon has this army stay in Moscow for an entire month, this camping there, which is very a questionable move. So Russia, so it's settling in, the winter settling in, the army can't sustain itself. So it's slow, the Russian army, I mean, not the Russian army, Napoleon's Grand Army is slowly running for its life. Desertion rates going sky high. Everyone's getting the hell out of there. Napoleon's like, okay, after this over, time to make a huge retreat. And the retreat becomes a gigantic rout. Um, so these are the numbers: 300,000 dead, 100,000 deserted, 120,000 captured. That's a lot to be captured. These people are dying from starvation and disease, really, and the cold weather. Um, all pieces, basically, their artillery is captured. That's to me, that's extremely important in this area. The artillery, 200 horses dead. Never again is Napoleon going to have massive cavalry forces after this. And fewer than 100 forces survived, and most are Prussian and Austrian contingents. And Prussia and Austria are not willing allies. They're bending the knee by complete force. So the surviving forces are not even going to stay with Napoleon, most of them. So basically, out of the 600,000 forces, almost none of them are left surviving. Um, and during this expedition, what happens is there was an attempted coup in France where there was a false report made where they said the emperor was killed or assassinated or something like that. It was a false report. So Napoleon is worried about his own political rule, where he's rushing home to France towards the end of this disaster. It lasted for half a year. This invasion attempt. So it's like this is a complete game changer for the Allies, the coalition forces. Um, I'll be right back. So the French Empire is now on the defensive, not on the offensive. So the French Empire is still huge, even though the Grand Army is completely obliterated. There's still a lot of resources, troops, particularly in Germany and Italy, to mobilize. Um, so everything is not over yet, and the Allied powers know this. So now that Russia is on the offensive, they defeat the invasion. Russia forges an alliance with Prussia to go on the offensive against Napoleon. So this is the fear of operations in Germany. Um, no one was expecting the French Empire to collapse in 1813, because the Emperor Napoleon still has a lot of resources at his disposal. But again, this tragic comedy, basically, where he's so arrogant and so greedy that he keeps being his own undoing, really, where he could have secured rule for life in a certain sense if he was more smart, Napoleon. But he's not. He refuses to the very end to see that the writing is on the wall. And he keeps doing that constantly. Um, so he mobilizes forces against the Prussians and the Russians. I'll get into a moment in a second here why Austria is not part of this yet. They remain neutral in the start, where he scores a series of victories against the Prussians and the Russians. So he's on his move in the theater operations in Germany. And they realize that, okay, Napoleon still has his game. We need time to prepare for to amass our forces. Basically, the coalition forces are basically saying, um, Russia, Austria, Russia, and Britain. This is going to be the game changer. So before So they're both having an armistice. Napoleon thinks he needs time to gather his troops because, I mean, the Grand Army's collapsed, completely obliterated. So he needs to create an entire new forces, basically, and all his horses are butchered too. So he has no cavalry. It's a pleasure with armistice. So Emperor Francis the First of Austria doesn't like Russia. He is thinking Russia is just going to replace Napoleon in Europe. Not only that, Emperor Francis the First now has dynastic ties to Napoleon for his daughter, Archduchess Marie Louise. Um, she is the Empress of France, and her son is the future king. He's going to be, I mean, not king, the future Emperor of France. And Emperor Francis the First of Austria is saying basically, these are my dynastic ties to France in the future. France and Austria are going to have very strong ties in the future if Napoleon holds his throne. And I'd rather have that over Russia have hegemony for, basically their empire over Europe. Um, which side is better? My own blood, or these Russians who are very bellicose and duplicitous themselves. Uh, he's preferring Napoleon. He sends Metternich over saying, "Look, if you give up all these territories, you can have peace." The Frankfurt proposals, basically, not the Frankfurt proposals. Um, this is before the Frankfurt proposals, and Napoleon is like, "This is before the Frankfurt proposals." And Napoleon is like, "Are you crazy? This is war." Because he's given up the Illyrian provinces, all these territories, and back to Austria. And this is going to secure the neutrality, basically, in the status quo, a new status quo, really. He says, and Metternich is negotiating on behalf of Russia and Austria too. I mean, Austria is negotiating on behalf of Russia and Russia too. Uh, Basically, giving up most of the French Empire, but not all of it. Just a huge chunk of it. Writings on the wall too, and Napoleon's like, no way. So they go to war. It's very indecisive in the start. So Napoleon's armies try chasing the coalition forces, and they keep evading Napoleon, and it pisses him off. So he decides to settle down, mass his forces, mass his forces at Leipzig, the town of Leipzig, and this completely backfires because he's like, okay, let's wait here and see where the coalition forces come to get us. Because he's smart, arrogant. This is a fatal mistake because the coalition forces, now amassed, are slowly amassing to make a direct strike on Leipzig. The Battle of Leipzig is a decisive victory for the coalition forces. Napoleon's forces completely collapse. The Germans and Italians now completely switch sides to the coalition side. So the French Empire is on its knees, basically. Um, so they offer another more negotiations. The Frankfurt proposals accept the borders of 1794, the French borders of 1794. How about that, Napoleon? So Emperor Francis the First is still like, I don't want to do this. And one of the major coalition armies under Crown Prince Bernadotte of Sweden, he's more interested in just annexing Norway, and he's a former marshal of Napoleon's. He's a Frenchman, and he's like, do I? And he's also worried about a Russian hegemony as well, Russian influence in Europe. So he along with Emperor Francis the First, and they are a huge part of the coalition forces, are very on the side about completely destroying the French Empire. But Napoleon is insane. Well, he's insane, basically. He's very arrogant. And they're like, we have proposals, but these are for naught because of the British invasion of Spain. Britain is invading Spain during this period. While these feudal operations is going on in 1813, Britain is now on the offensive. So it's been holding Portugal this whole period of time, but now it advances into Spain and it conquers, well, not conquers, but repulses the French out of Spain. And the British are now prepared to invade France. So Britain with the Spanish and Portuguese forces, so there's a lot of forces are ready to invade France in the south. Austria, Russia, Prussia are ready to invade from the west. Um, the French Empire surrounded on all sides. It's completely over for them. And Britain forms what's called the Quadruple Alliance with Prussia, Austria, and Russia. And they offer this proposal, the 1792 borders proposal. And for some odd reason, Napoleon is still, I don't know, in denial. He's saying, no, I still have a chance. I still have a chance. So he actually, the campaign of France, 1814, Napoleon actually gets a bunch of decisive victories during the campaign of, in the campaign in 1814. But his forces are completely obliterated. They're dwindling down to young children, basically, at this point. He has all these major powers. He literally completely surrounded France. It's game over. um, so basically, this is a quote. You can pause the video and read it. This is him responding to the French government saying, "Hey, I think it's time for us to call it quits. It's basically over with." And this is Napoleon's response to his own government saying it's time to start negotiating a ceasefire at the end because it's over with. And Napoleon's like, "How dare you?" um, and then his own marshals are saying, "It's over, Napoleon. We want to save our own skins. Um, we're abandoning this basically." And basically, the French government has a coup under former Foreign Minister Talleyrand. Um, he orchestrates it really. French government has a coup, invites the Bourbon monarchy, which has not reigned for the last several decades, basically, back to the throne of France, the Bourbon Restoration, and it's over with. It's over. Napoleon is forced to exile. He attempts to commit suicide by poison. He fails, um, and he's exiled to an island of the Kingdom of Elba. It's an island off the Italian coast, and he's given a pretty good pension, very good deal, a few million pounds pension every year. I mean, who wouldn't take that? Um, Napoleon wouldn't take that. Um, he's still in Europe. He's forced to exile from France, but he's still in Europe. Elba is a pretty nice island. Um, who would give that up? So the French Empire is over with in 1814. And great powers start negotiating at the Congress of Vienna to restore the balance of power, right? So this is another lesson like the Latin America, Haiti, War of 1812. This is another subject. And this is in sequence the next lesson after the Napoleonic Wars. So basically the great powers restore the balance of power to Europe, where they're saying basically we need to avoid a disastrous war like this because this went on for about 20 years. There's millions of casualties. We need to create a status quo where everyone is appeased and happy with their empires. And we try to avoid major conflicts from now on. And it does work kind of. There's no longer any wars that are going to go on for like 70 years or something like that, which is what the 1700s look like basically. Um, so this is the collapse of the French Empire and the new balance of power created in Europe, which I won't get into. So this is going on. The Congress of Vienna is going on in 1814, and the Bourbon monarchy under King Louis XVIII is restored to France, and he's very unpopular with the French people because it looks like a return to feudalism basically because they're very conservative, and the church and nobles are expected to take back all their properties that were purchased by citizens. So very unpopular. Napoleon on his island is witnessing this happening in France where the monarchy is unpopular and negotiations on the restoration of Europe is going on. Um, When you cry, "Long live the king," this guy, our men will we will answer, "Long live the emperor." So Napoleon, of course, arrogant, greedy, uh, defies the Treaty of Paris that outlawed him from France, and he goes back to France after a year, 1814. It's 1815 basically, um, 1815. Um, and he goes to Paris and becomes emperor again. Basically, the monarchy, King Louis. I mean, basically, an army was sent out to arrest Napoleon when they heard he arrived back in France because he was outlawed. It's illegal for him to be in France. So an army is sent out to arrest him. And what they end up doing is having an emotional brace for Napoleon, saying, "Long live the emperor! Napoleon is back." Basically, the glory days are back. No, they're not. But he goes to Paris. Um, King Louis XVIII and his court flees France. I believe it was Antwerp, Belgium, or Holland. I don't remember. Um, he flees and he becomes the emperor, but he makes the government democratic. He has all these revolutionary reforms now because he realizes he needs to not have absolute power like he did um, in what's called 100 days. And he thinks he can negotiate with the the great powers of Europe, but they offered him all these negotiations before, first of all, and realize he can't stay in power. They don't. He has no chance of staying in power, no matter how much forces he mobilizes at this point. Um, they're like Napoleon's like sending out missives saying, "Let's negotiate now that I'm back in power." Um, Congress of Vienna's negotiations are basically done with. 1814. Um, in 1814, they basically settled up on the new balance of power of Europe in Europe, basically. Napoleon's like, just let me be emperor, or I won't do what I did in the past. Promises, swears he's, yeah, right. No, they don't believe that. They don't believe him. They completely block all his missives. They're like, we cannot have him back in power ever again. Um, and what's called the 100 Days of Napoleon's return to power. His forces are eventually decisively defeated at the Battle of Waterloo, basically. Um, his government falls, but this time he's exiled far away to an island out in the middle of nowhere called St. Helena. Um, and he's never going to come back. This is him in old age, basically. He's an old man, sick, very disillusioned. Um, and he can never return to France again after this because Britain has control of the seas, basically. So it's over for Napoleon. So his legacy was, in a certain sense, very devastating in terms of casualties, millions of deaths, frankly. Um, his own arrogance was his own undoing. He was not, when it came to diplomacy, he probably could do it with an iron hand all the time. Um, that was also part of his own undoing. Um, but his legacy will last for the next century to come. His empire brought the Napoleonic code to areas where feudalism existed, and liberal ideals basically are flourishing in Europe now because of him, and in Latin America. Nationalist ideas are happening in Italy and Germany now because of Napoleon's empire, where he basically combined Germany together. He combined Italy together under his kingdom. So the Ottoman Empire is collapsing. Uh, it is a huge game changer what he did, and we're going to see very. I mean, there's like multiple lessons you can reference the Napoleonic Wars. Really, this is a world war, and you can see its impacts everywhere. Latin America, India, Egypt, the Balkans, Spain, Britain. It changes everything from economics to law to ideas. So was he I don't know. He's very a controversial figure to say the least. But his days from I mean he caused so many deaths, frankly. But his days, he's remembered as a great man. He's remembered as a hero. His marshals, people of common origin rising to power. This was an age of heroes, and the French people never really forget Napoleon in memory. And his own memory is going to have very heavy influence among the French people and their civilians in the future as the government changes. The Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII is restored to France. France has to pay a huge reparations basically to the Allied powers. Um, but his influence on France, especially his name itself, never fades. And France is going to go through a lot of political chaos in the future because of the French Revolution. But this is it with the Napoleonic Wars. And this is an end to the lecture. I do want to say I would create a two-part lecture, but I would not say as much as I did here. I would try to keep track of time. Um, for 2 days, I would hand out two maybe primary source documents. Um, keep the lectures at 25 to 30 minutes, so that's 15, 20 minutes. Have the kids read a primary source document and these few notes, really only the highlighted notes, which is not that much. But that's the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Um, at the end to the narrative though, because there's a lot of lessons connected to the Napoleonic Wars. I just can't get into them here because there's a lot of them, frankly, to be honest. But that's it.